We're live. The debate is capitalism versus communism. We have the mouthy infidel with me. He's going to be taking the side of communism. I'm going to be defending capitalism. And if he has an opening statement, feel free to make it now.
Yeah, so I guess it's sort of perplexing as a Marxist to try and formulate like a short and quick argument as to why capitalism is bad, as any sort of well read Marxist has consumed multiple Bible length books detailing all of the different reasons why one might object to capitalism. But I guess if I were to try and bring it down to a few core reasons why I think that capitalism is a flawed system which we no longer should accept, it would be something along the lines of the following few critiques. So I think capitalism is unstable. There's been a large body of data which has shown that wherever and whenever capitalism has existed on the planet throughout its history, it has always brought with it a strange sort of instability where every 4 to 7 years there's a downturn. And what this means is that every 4 to 7 years, people lose their jobs, people's lives are ruined, suicide rates skyrocket, all of these terrible externalities. And this is only something that exists within capitalism. For all their faults, slave society didn't have this instability or the same form of instability, and neither did feudal society. And it has to do with the internal mechanisms of capital circulation, why this instability exists. And so I don't see any reason why we should choose to live with a system that brings about this horrible instability. And I guess the other two claims I would make about capitalism is, for one, it breeds an enormous level of inequality, which not only is a misallocation of resources, if we are trying to allocate resources in a way which brings about the greatest amount of well-being for the greatest amount of people, but this inequality also brings about a large number of other externalities, such as increased crime rates and societal dysfunction and so on. And I guess my final point would be that capitalism is intrinsically undemocratic. We generally like the idea of democracy in the U.S. because we've accepted the premise that if we want the decisions which are made in a society to be in the interests of the majority of people, it should be the majority of people who make those decisions. And this is generally a good premise, I think. I think that's sort of axiomatic. I want the greatest outcomes for the greatest number of people, and it's pretty axiomatic that if that's what you want, you should have the mass of people making the decisions. But for some reason, this premise has been lost when it comes to the structure of the enterprise, right? When you look at the structure of the enterprise, it's fundamentally a private dictatorship where a few board of directors accountable to a few shareholders make all of the decisions which the mass of workers have to live with. So if the board of directors says, hey, we want to send your job overseas, too bad. If the board of directors says, hey, we want to automate your jobs away, too bad, and so on. So I think it's sort of a bad way to organize a society where the mass of people have to live with the decisions which they had no say in making. So I guess those would be my three opening core objections to capitalism.
Okay. Here are my core objections to communism. One, while it might look decent on paper, it does not work in the real world. Two, every society that has tried it has failed miserably and become a massive authoritarian, totalitarian state. The people that live under it are generally poorer and worse off than their capitalistic neighbors across the pond. In communism, there is slavery. You just happen to be a slave of the state. There is massive inequality in communism. There have been several examples of this over the years. In capitalism, you actually do have equality. You have equality of opportunity. You do not have equality of outcome, nor should anyone expect an equal outcome. You don't work a job because you are forced to, like a totalitarian communist state would tell you to. You are free to leave any job at any time if, for whatever reason, it's not meeting your needs, you want to move up in the world, or you just don't like working for the company. Mm-hmm. You're free to leave. Capitalism is based on a consensual contract or act between two consenting parties. Mm-hmm. In communism, there is no consent. You are going to do what they tell you to do, or they will hurt you. And finally, communism is one. It goes against human nature because we are not social creatures; we're predators. But two, and this is the big thing, communism breeds no innovation. That's why Russia and China has to steal our tech. They don't create their own. I'll give you a real quick example. In the 80s, at the dawn of the Nintendo thing, there was one game produced in Russia. Everybody knows what it is. It's Tetris. But that game, if it was produced under a capitalist society, would have been the creator's property. Under communism, it was the state's property. And also, the one final point is capitalism is predicated on you having a right to someone else's labor. You do not. In capitalism, you can buy for an agreed upon price the fruits of their labor, but you have no right to it. Communism dictates that you have a right to someone's labor.
Okay, and those were all your points?
Yeah, without getting into specifics, just figured I'd keep it broad.
Okay, yeah, no, that works. All right, so I guess to start off, so if I were to summarize your points, because I want to make sure I'm not missing anything, because I just thought I would write what you said down. So your core arguments are communism hasn't worked, communism goes against human nature, communism is coercive, whereas capitalism is based around voluntary exchange. Communism doesn't create innovation, and communism is authoritarian, and communism gives you the right to someone else's labor. So do you think those were like all your main points?
Yeah, the only other one I would bring up is actually in this country we don't live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic.
Okay.
We're not a direct democracy.
Right.
We're a constitutional republic because direct democracies, unfortunately, they don't work either. Then you get the tyranny of the majority.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess to sort of go through your points one by one, and you can stop me if you want to zero in on a specific point because it's I don't want to get too bogged down to where we're each giving 30-minute responses.
Okay, yeah, let's try to keep it rapid fire a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as for your first point, communism hasn't worked. So here's where I would disagree with that. So while it is true that I don't think any attempt at communism has thus far brought about a successful communist society, at least not communist by the Marxian definition, which is the definition I employ when arguing about communism. While this is true, I don't think this makes the argument that communism can't work or that we should stick with capitalism then. Because the issue that I think that commits is if you look at capitalism, as capitalism emerged out of slave society, because we've not always had capitalism. First we had slave society, then we had feudal society, and capitalism emerged out of feudal society. And as capitalism emerged out of feudal society...
Wait, hold up.
Yeah.
Okay, you said slave society, then feudal society.
Basically.
Are you talking about, the Greek city-states where we kind of got our government from? I mean, yes, there was slavery in both the Roman and the Greek societies. But I would also say there was a strong bit of capitalism in the Roman societies, and people lived far longer, lived much better lives under that system than when it fell, and that led into the feudal society, where you had a few people that, yes, controlled everything, and then 99% of the population was dirt poor peasants. But the feudal society doesn't allow capitalism.
Right. So that wasn't really like the point I was trying to make. So obviously, depending on how you define capitalism, there's been varying degrees of, for example, market exchange throughout history and so on. But insofar as I'm defining capitalism, I'm just talking about like generalized commodity production and the employer-employee dynamic and so on. But this is sort of like irrelevant to the point I was making, I guess. The point that I was just trying to make is, at one point in time, we had a dominant feudal society, right? And then capitalism emerged out of feudalism, right? And as capitalism was emerging out of feudalism, there were numerous capitalist attempts at capitalist societies that failed in initial implementation. So it doesn't seem like something specific to communism, right? Because capitalism didn't emerge out of feudalism in one perfect, foul swoop. Capitalism emerged out of feudal society after many failed attempts. And after all of these failed attempts, capitalists finally looked back on all of the countless failed attempts to see, okay, what worked, what went wrong, and how can we correct for what went wrong in a way which brings about a capitalist society that doesn't get rejected. And then that finally happened. And it makes sense, because when you're moving to a whole new mode of production, it would make sense that you're not just going to, get it perfect on the first try. There's going to be errors and things that don't work, and you're going to have to correct for these errors. The same thing happened with capitalism, and I would expect that with communism. So in pointing out that, communism hasn't led to a successful communist society yet, that doesn't make the argument that communism can't work. That just makes the argument that communism has followed the same developmental path as capitalism did, and also as feudalism did. So I don't really think that necessarily, makes the argument that you're trying to make.
Well, my point to that is, capitalism has brought us in roughly 250 short years from the horse and cart and basically the colonial times to right now with iPhone, whatever the hell we're on, iPhone 24. And communism has done nothing but lead to stagnation and basically utter ruination, because it has to be set up like that. You have to have this unbelievably controlling strong state to make it work, because it by its very nature, it relies on something that human beings are not capable of doing, and that is essentially communal living. I'll give you a real quick example. Let's say you have two towns, and they both have tin mines in them. And one makes pewter figurines, and the other makes bronze figurines. The reason I bring this up is pewter is tin mixed with a little bit of copper, and bronze is, of course, the exact opposite. A little bit of copper, or a lot of copper, mixed with a little bit of tin. But in the middle of the two towns is a copper mine. Now, under capitalism, the copper mine just sells what one town needs and sells what the other town needs, and everybody makes a profit and everybody's happy. But under communism, at least what the loose definition I've got from it is that if the copper town has a bigger population than the pewter producing town, well, they can just take all the copper for themselves and leave the other town with nothing, because that's what has happened time and time again under communism, because, the whole, for the greater good type of thing. Capitalism takes care of everyone.
So, okay, so before I delve into the, previous points that you made, so what's the flaw, I guess, in communism that you're illustrating by bringing up the copper example?
Yeah, basically, in a communist utopia, everyone would just share their resources and everyone would be happy. The reality is human beings are competitive.
Okay, all right.
Capitalism's the only thing that works, basically, it works because it encourages that. It encourages competition and innovation and invention. Communism doesn't.
Okay, so to get to the first point, so the first point you made when refuting my point about the capitalism also failed before eventually succeeding, you bring up the fact that capitalism has brought us lots of innovations and industrialization and so on, whereas communism has not been able to show that it brings the same amount of flourishing, and it has led to stagnation. But I think that sort of misses the core point of the argument that I was making, which is that sure, capitalism eventually became the globally dominant system and eventually succeeded and played its historical role of rapidly industrializing. Marxists don't deny this. Marx himself wrote about how capitalism had a progressive role in history, and that progressive role was its role in rapidly industrializing and so on. And so it did succeed, and it did play its historical role. But I don't think you can compare that to communism and say, well, capitalism succeeded and communism didn't succeed. That means, capitalism is better than communism, because they're in two different stages of historical development, right? Communism is still in the stage where it has not yet became the globally dominant mode of production, right? And capitalism.
I could argue that in the 70s, in particular, there were way more communist countries than capitalist countries, but they all collapsed. I believe in the 70s, 2/3 of the world's countries were either Soviet satellite states or communist countries.
I don't think that that's true. I don't think. Well, first of all, I don't think there's ever been like a place that has fully implemented communism in the way that I'm defining it. But there's been in no point in human history where the majority of countries haven't had generalized commodity production and so on and been capitalist insofar as that's why I'm defining what capitalism is. But I guess the gist of what I'm saying is that for every mode of production throughout history, it has failed multiple times in initial implementation before finding out, why it failed initially and what they could work on. And then eventually these mode of production succeeded. That's what happened as feudal society emerged out of slave society and as capitalist society emerged out of feudal society. So pointing to the fact that communism hasn't succeeded yet and it's only so far led to stagnation, that argument doesn't make the point that communism isn't a workable mode of production and that we should abandon the idea of communism. That just shows that it's followed the same developmental path as capitalism. And yes, capitalism has succeeded and communism hasn't, because capitalism is on a different stage of development. It already went through its initial failures and found out what it needed to do different, and then eventually succeeded. Communism has still.
Can I ask for a point of clarification?
Yeah.
What were the phases of? Because this is confusing to me. What were the phases of capitalism that failed? I'd like to know.
Yeah. So.
Because I'm sorry, but you could argue that America was really the first free market capitalist society out there. Because we were the ones that basically kickstarted the Industrial Revolution because of it.
Right. So,
and then Europe Europe kind of adopted some of the stuff we were doing, especially Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to know because capitalism's always been around one form or another, be it trading for a monetary system, usually in ye olde times it was copper, silver, and gold, or bartering, which is a form of capitalism.
Right.
So I'm just curious which one.
So first of all, Marxists don't really define capitalism as just like having trade or whatever. Capitalists define Marxists define capitalism as, the existence of generalized commodity production and, production for exchange value generalized across the entire economy and so on. Whereas, in feudal society and in slave society, a lot of the times the majority of production took place for the purpose of, the use of the slave and the master and so on. So I guess that's just a point of clarification by what we mean by capitalism, and by that definition, capitalism really has not existed throughout all of history. And I would also argue that that's not just the Marxist definition of capitalism, but that's generally the proper definition of capitalism to use, because that's the only characteristic, generalized commodity production, where if we focus on that, it actually differentiates capitalism in a meaningful way from prior modes of production. Allow me to answer your question real quick.
All right, I'll rebut a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the examples of early failed capitalist experiments, because the U.S. wasn't the first capitalist society, really. And also America only succeeded because there was literally no way it couldn't succeed. But that's, I guess, another point, because it had so many years of so much investment and so on. But so some examples of early failed capitalist experiments that I was referring to include several early northern Italian city-states, the Federal Republic of Central America, Gran Colombia, the Peru-Bolivian Federation, the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, the early Empire of Brazil, and so on. So there were many capitalist experiments which failed in initial implementation, until they found out how to make a capitalist, or, failed in the sense of were rejected by the people because it went in directions that were horrible, or just imploded on itself due to its own instability and so on. And this happened many times. It failed many times, just as communism has failed many times before eventually succeeding. And that's why I don't think pointing to the fact that communism, in attempts at initially implementing it, hasn't yet succeeded isn't a valid argument against communism. Because if the argument was communism has failed initially, therefore it's unworkable, then you could have said the same thing as capitalism was emerging out of feudal society. But obviously that conclusion wouldn't have been correct, because you're sitting here arguing for capitalism right now. So clearly that must be some sort of fallacious logic to say that just because it's failed in initial implementation, it's an unworkable system. And I guess you can respond to me, because I just sort of said a lot, and then I guess I can respond to you and address some of the other points you made about how it's against human nature and so on.
Well, you said that America had no chance to fail. They may not have taught this in history class. It's a war that America likes to forget. It was the War of 1812, where Britain successfully invaded America. Mm-hmm. But they didn't have the resources to hold the country, and they also knew that every American citizen had a gun. But capitalism, at least as I understand the definition of it, is basically the consensual transactional relationships of goods and services. It's a free market, so the forces of the free market dictate what things are worth. And again, it breeds innovation and invention, and because human beings are naturally competitive, it satiates that competitiveness. Also, again, in capitalism, you have the freedom to move up and down from poor to rich and rich to poor. The reason communism has never worked is it requires people being constantly told what to do, or working for, again, that greater good. Notice one of the guys in your icon there is Lenin. Do you know what one of the first things he did was he forced all the farmers? Well, one, he took all their property and took all their money. But instead of the farmers being able to sell their wheat or whatever they grew for a fair price to the city folk, Lenin decided that because we all live in the great communist society, you will be forced to give your food. And then when the farmers went out and started to dig through the dirt and get the scraps, Lenin took that and then shot them. Mm-hmm. So the communism doesn't work because, quite frankly, you can't tell people what they're going to do, and communism requires that. And also, it goes against human beings' natures. If we were not human, if we were like an ant colony, communism might work. But we're not. We're humans. And not even the great apes live in peaceful societies with one another. Mm-hmm. Chimpanzees kill each other all the time. So it just kind of goes against our nature. And I somewhat reject this notion capitalism, I mean, in one form or another, it is far older than communism. But I think you say communism is younger, even though it did come out of feudal society, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. It's already proven itself to be a failed experiment. It's one of those things that looks good on paper, but when put into practical purpose, it just doesn't work. It almost can't, unless something drastically is changed. I'll give communism this. I'll cede this. If we all lived in communities of, let's say, 200 people, mm-hmm. then communism might work. If we lived in very small, isolated communities. But we don't. We live in a society of 330 million. Capitalism is the best vehicle to basically make our lives possible. Mm-hmm. And again, capitalism also allows us the freedom to basically do whatever the fuck we want. Mm-hmm. You know?
Okay, yeah, so I guess, so when I say that America basically couldn't fail, you're right, there was, the War of 1812, but that's not what I was referring to, and that was basically the only challenge that America faced as far as whether or not it would become, successful. So when I said it basically couldn't fail, I was more so referring to
I won't go into history.
Yeah, sure. I was just to clarify, I was just referring to the massive amounts of European capital that went into the American colony and the sheer profitability of so many of the resources there and so on. It was basically set up in such a way that it would have been very difficult for it to fail. So it's not, yeah. So and as far as your other points, so there's a lot there, but. I guess I'm not too worried because a lot of the things you keep coming back to, I've written down, as far as what your initial points were. So, I guess as far as your point that communism, again, you make this point that communism hasn't worked. It's shown to be an unsuccessful experiment. But again, I think that I just don't agree with that logic, because you're saying that communism has shown to be an unworkable system because it's failed in initial in attempts at its implementation. But I think that if this logic were true, if failures in initial implementation meant unworkability, it would be impossible for us to be living under capitalism right now. So I think that must be fallacious reasoning. And also, as far as your point that I think you brought up that.
Wait.
Well, hold on.
Okay,
I respond to so many.
Okay, because I'm just curious of how you feel that capitalism is unworkable, despite the fact that it's succeeded.
I'm not saying that it's unworkable. I said that if failure in initial implementation meant that a system was unworkable, then capitalism would be unworkable. And clearly that's not the case, because we live under capitalism right now. Capitalism did become the global mode of production. So clearly failure in initial implementation doesn't necessarily indicate the unworkability of a system, and therefore bringing up the fact that communism has failed and hasn't been successfully implemented in its initial attempts at implementation can't mean that it's an unworkable system that should be abandoned and has been shown to be intrinsically unsuccessful. But I guess to get to your other point, because we did have a little bit of a back and forth about what capitalism meant, because you say that capitalism is essentially just completely free markets and so on. And I hear a lot of libertarians say this, but I don't think that that's a good definition for capitalism if we're trying to contextualize capitalism historically, which is generally what we try to do when we try to define historical occurrences. because capitalism throughout its history, the state has played a tremendous role in capitalist societies from its very beginnings. The state has been a robust factor in capitalist societies. So I don't think that it's historically very accurate to say that capitalism is simply defined as completely free markets and completely voluntary transaction and so on. So I do think that the best definition for capitalism, the definition that actually differentiates it in a meaningful way from prior modes of production, is generalized commodity production for the sake of exchange value, generalized across the entire economy and so on. And also, I think you keep going back to this point that the reason communism just can't work is because it's against human nature, and humans are just naturally greedy, and so communism and communal arrangements don't agree or can't work or whatever. I don't agree with that, of course. So I read a book a while back. There's a very famous book written by an evolutionary biologist called Pyotr Kropotkin, who is also a communist. And it's called Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution. And what he illustrates in this book is that not only is the capacity for humans to engage in mutual aid and communal arrangements a factor of evolution, which is present in all animals and has been shown to be present in humans throughout history, but human society actually flourishes more when we base societies around mutual aid and cooperation rather than, greed and competition. And so, for example, he gave examples like Netherlands in the late 1800s, where there was a largely communal arrangement and so on. So I think that and one of the key aspects of Marxist philosophy is this idea of dialectical materialism, that everything is sort of contradictory and fluid and constantly changing. And I think this applies very well to human nature, because I think history has shown us that human nature has lots of contradicting aspects to it, which have been actualized to different extents and different points in society. I think I've done a lot of anthropological research, as have many other Marxists, and the general conclusion which modern anthropology draws is that every aspect of quote-unquote human nature that we thought to be intrinsic and immutable has shown historically to not be. So just in conclusion, my point on human nature would be, I think human nature is contradictory and fluid and constantly changing. I think we have both the capacity for mutual aid and cooperation as well as competition and, this survival of the fittest mentality. And I think that the idea that we don't have this capacity for mutual aid and cooperation is historically inaccurate, because there have been detailed writings about many societies throughout history which have built society around this ethos and flourished tremendously. So I reject the human nature argument. And I guess the final point that you made was, I believe, innovation. And after the innovation point, is that all the points you made, or were there any other points that you made?
No. If there is, I'm not remembering it because I'm just writing down what you're saying, because I want to rebut some of this when you're done.
Yeah,
Go for
it. Sure. So I guess the final point I would make, if there were no other points than innovation, then I've covered everything. But I guess the final point I would make is regarding innovation. There was a Harvard Business Review study that came out a while ago showing that innovations which were made not for profit and were not protected by patents and which were distributed for free are increasingly competing in many parts of the economy with for-profit patent-protected innovations. And the authors of this Harvard study said flatly that the conclusion of the study is that the profit motive is not needed to innovate. It's not the only incentive. There are other incentives for innovation, and not only are there other incentives, but these other incentives are stronger than the profit motive and are outcompeting the profit motive as we speak in many parts of the economy. And you can say, well, yes, but there may be other incentives and even stronger incentives, but the profit motive adds a supplement. And still, if you get rid of the profit motive, then there will be a net loss in the amount of innovation that we see. But I would disagree with that. I think it's a bit more of a zero-sum game, actually. Because I think that while the profit motive does play a prominent role in incentivizing innovation, I think the profit motive in creating a society which is built around profit and greed and so on actively suppresses other motivations for innovation. It suppresses other motivations for innovation, such as just wanting to do it for personal development or the community, by creating this aspect of alienation and the need to serve wage labor and so on. And so I think if you get rid of the profit motive, then the other motives which we see right now existing, which are stronger than the profit motive, even under capitalism, would become more prominent. And so I think we have no basis on which to say that getting rid of capitalism would lead to a net reduction in the incentive to create a profit.
Okay. Allow me to rebut the slew of points. But America was profitable in the very, very early stages by a few European loans, namely the Dutch, and I believe France gave us a loan too. But after that, it was mainly profitable due to the fact that it was one of the first nations to industrialize. It has an abundance of farmland. And quite frankly, we also took over as the world's lone superpower after World War II because Europe was bombed to oblivion. So we were the only game in town that could make anything for decades. Humans are not communal, nor are any other animals in the grand scheme of things. And what I mean by that is, while apes might live in a pod with their fellow family members, essentially, if another ape pod moves in, there's going to be a fight. Ant colonies, while they're communal with their own colony, if another ant colony moves in, there's a war. Lion prides fight with lion prides, tigers fight with tigers. I mean, whales kill each other. I do not see in nature any sort of communal living, and what they fight over is the same thing that humans have fought over for centuries, and that's resources. It's just capitalism says, hey, I'll give you my resources if you give me this. Usually money. I do not know any society that has ever had mutual cooperation with another without either A, an end goal for the benefit of both, or B, a mutual enemy. Outside of that, I don't know where this mutual cooperation has ever existed in history. It really hasn't. There's two reasons nations team up. One is an end goal, the other is a mutual enemy. Communism, as I was stating, with animals fighting over resources. Now, to be fair, capitalism does need a bit of regulation because unrestrained, unrestricted capitalism does lead into some very bad things. Look at South Africa with monopolies. But communism always has to end in a totalitarian, authoritative state because, once again, like the animals fighting over the resources, once the people start to bitch for some farmland or other finite resource, the state has to step in and mandate it. Human beings are going to grab as much shit as they can for themselves and their family and maybe their community. Fuck the other community. You know, I mean, does anyone here in the chat or my discussion give a crap about some farm family in Idaho? The answer is, of course, no. We don't know them. We don't, I would like to know what innovations are made outside of profit motive. I'm OBS. I don't know why they're not charging for it. The profit motive, unfortunately, is probably the best reason why we create anything. You make a better baby beanie, you'd like to get some money for it. Now, is there hobbies? Yes, of course. Like I said, this is a mistake that I'll give you a perfect example. Artists. A lot of them don't view their art as a product. Well, if they're going to make a living as an artist, they should, because It is. Their art is the product they're selling. Now, if you want to just paint for painting's sake, that's fine. But then it's a hobby. But if you want to make it your job, your profession, then you better start looking at your art as a commodity, a product to be bought and sold. And quite frankly, I tend to think that there's a reason why typically every communist nation is 30 years behind development of a capitalist nation. If we do have certain, socialist programs, like take welfare for one, we can afford to do it. They really can't. You mentioned how, I believe in the beginning of this debate, how about every 7 years we kind of have a little recession, and then it goes back, and little recession but it's always been on an upward trajectory. Quite frankly, it just keeps getting better. Communism, if they get one bad hit to their economy, they're done. Because everything is like, again, Lenin. He led the vast industrialization of Russia, but he also left out the agricultural sector. Well, you can't really run a factory if your workers are hungry. Capitalism is something that if there's a need for it, capitalism will fill the need because people want to make money. Like I'll give you a perfect. I'll give one example quick. Truckers. In the 70s and the 80s, there was an overabundance of them. Mm-hmm. And every mom told their kids, don't be a trucker, don't be a job, you'll be a loser, gas station, fucking pedophile if you become a trucker. Nobody became a trucker. Now all the truckers are basically retiring. Now, because there is a shortage of people to fill the job, capitalism has basically said, hey, truckers, now you're making six figures, which is true. So capitalism has a way of, anytime we have a shortage of something, capitalism has a way of filling it in, whereas communism, it can't react fast enough. So I guess those are my points. If you'd like to rebut, go for it.
Yeah, okay. So, you said America was only profitable in its early stages. I think that's largely true, but I don't think that necessarily contradicts the point I was making. And you say that it was largely because of the resources that they had available, and I would add it was also largely because of the development of the European economy and the amounts of capital that they invested, into America and so on. And so, yeah, I think I agree with you largely on the reasons why America succeeded. And that's sort of what I was saying. Like, the only reason America succeeded was because it had such favorable conditions, from the amount that was invested in it to the profitability of the resources, etc. Whereas, so many other early capitalist experiments completely failed in initial implementation. And that was sort of the point that I was making, is to say that early capitalist experiments also failed, and yet capitalism eventually became the dominant mode of production. So to say that early communist experiments have failed doesn't necessarily mean that communism is intrinsically unworkable, because if that conclusion followed from that premise, then we wouldn't be living under capitalism, but of course we are. Another thing you said was that humans are constantly in conflict, and that in order for humans not to be in conflict with one another, they need to, have a common benefit. But I think there intrinsically is a common benefit in engaging in mutual aid. So the idea of mutual aid is that humans are capable of great degrees of cooperation and so on to build a successful society that works for everybody, and even between different communal arrangements to engage in behaviors which is beneficial to everyone and builds a more cohesive and peaceful society. And so you say that a society built around communal arrangements and mutual aid and cooperation rather than competition is impossible, because you need a common benefit in order to achieve that. but I think that there will always be a common benefit in engaging in mutual aid, because as Kropotkin pointed out in his analysis of historical examples of societies built around mutual aid, these societies allow for a great amount of human flourishing. So I think the very thing that you say is needed in order for mutual aid and cooperation to work is intrinsic to mutual aid and cooperation in the way that I'm proposing it. And you say, like, well, I haven't seen any societies that have made it work. Again, mutual aid is it's a very long analysis of several historical examples. I can give you one right now. The Netherlands in the early 1800s were an example of societies which were not built around competition and profit and so on, but were based around communal arrangements and cooperation and so on. I think this is very much within the bounds of human nature. Several societies have lived with this ethos and have implemented this ethos and have flourished tremendously due to having this arrangement of cooperation. So I think to say that this is contradictory to human nature is a misreading of history. And on that note, you also say that even if within groups people might be able to cooperate and so on, there'll always be conflict between groups. And you say that humans have always been at war and so on, and have always been in conflict. This actually isn't true. So, for example, I read a little while ago, there was an interesting article written by a woman whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, who was a research director at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. It's a French term. And it was published in a scientific journal in 2015. And the premise was, no, humans did not always wage war. And it states that war started 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic period with the birth of the productive economy, accumulation of resources, and a change in productive structures. And this is the Marxist view. Marx and Engels talk about the base superstructure relationship, where changes in the mode of production change sort of the ways in which humans relate to each other and the broader society. And so, no, it's not true to say that, war and conflict between different communes and cooperation between groups is impossible and not conducive to human nature. It is conducive to human nature. The only reason it hasn't existed within capitalism or prior modes of production was because of the way in which the productive forces had developed up till that historical period. And so I guess I wholeheartedly think that a honest historical analysis, as have been provided in multiple studies and books and academic works which I've just presented, have shown that cooperation between groups and within groups and mutual aid in the way in which communism advocates is not contradictory to human nature. It is very conducive to human nature, and this has been shown to actually work. Not only is it conducive to human nature, but it is conducive to human nature to such an extent that it creates a larger degree of flourishing than any society based around competition and profit and so on. Another big point you made is you say communism is authoritarian and will always lead to authoritarianism. This is a strange point to me. It's not strange, because it's a very common misconception of Marxism and of communism that it's always going to be, authoritarian government does everything. In fact, you mentioned Lenin and how, Lenin did some authoritarian things. Well, that's true, but Lenin also never claimed to live in communism. Lenin was trying to set the stage for the transition to communism through rapid industrialization in Russia and so on, because Russia was a very poor, basically third world country that needed rapid authoritarian, industrialization in order to eventually transition to communism in Lenin's view. So that doesn't show communism as authoritarian. And I think communism, I agree that many places which have attempted communism have delved into authoritarianism, but also many haven't. For example, the Paris Commune never devolved into an authoritarian state. It was crushed externally. The same goes for revolutionary Catalonian and so on. I think there have been a plethora of historical examples of leftist experiments which were trying to achieve communism or socialism, which never devolved into authoritarianism. And so it can't be the transition to communism which leads to authoritarianism, because it not always has. And communism itself certainly is not authoritarian, because communism, by the definition of Marx, by the definition of Engels, even by the definitions of Lenin and Stalin, is intrinsically a stateless society, and even a governmentless society where people learn to cooperate organically without the need of a coercive state, and so on. Because, as Lenin wrote in his book, The State and Revolution, this state is a historical product of the irreconcilability of class conflict, and only exists because of class conflict. And with the destruction of class conflict, the state must be abolished. And so communism is not authoritarian. It's intrinsically anti-authoritarian. Marx even wrote in the Critique of Gotha Program that it's the free organization of independent producers, or something along those lines. So according to Marxists, even the ones who are considered the big bad authoritarian Marxists, communism is intrinsically anti-state, anti-government, anti-authoritarian. And so I reject this characterization that it's intrinsically authoritarian, or that it's even always led to authoritarianism, because I don't think it has. You also say, I would like to ask you one more question after I just finish running down the rest of the points. You also say that the profit motive is needed to innovate. But again, I would bring up this study I was bringing up. It's by, I can read you I can send it to you over Discord if necessary. It's called "People Don't Need a Profit Motive to Innovate. The Finding: Innovations developed by individuals who give them away increasingly compete with patent-protected for-profit innovations in many parts of the economy." And this is analysis of several empirical studies by a reputable scientific organization. So I think that the idea that the profit motive is needed to innovate, or is the best way to innovate, is empirically unfounded, and empirical evidence seems to go against it. You again bring up the idea that every communist nation has failed, but again, I can grant that without saying that communism is intrinsically unworkable. Because obviously, failure in initial implementation doesn't necessarily imply the unworkability of a system, because if it did, that would mean capitalism would have been unworkable, but clearly that isn't true, because we live under capitalism right now. And then you say, finally, that in capitalism, production meets needs, and communism cannot meet people's needs. So as far as the idea that in capitalism, production meets people's needs, and you gave the example of the truckers, I sort of agree, but sort of disagree, because the Marxist view has never been that capitalism and the reasons for production under capitalism are completely separated for the needs of humanity. Of course, capitalists are always going to have an incentive to, produce so people are happy and will keep buying their products, and so on. The problem isn't that under capitalism, exchange value, or the profit motive, and the needs of humanity are completely separated all the time. That's clearly not the case. The problem, rather, is that under capitalism, what's profitable doesn't always correlate to what is useful for society. And in the cases that these two things separate, capitalism chases profit every time at the expense of the needs of humanity. So there's a plethora of examples. Take wars in the Middle East, which by no means are necessary for humanity or good for humanity, but they were pursued by capitalists because they could make billions of dollars selling arms to various radical groups and through federal contracts and so on. Or take climate change for an example, which is not beneficial to society by any stretch, but which is pursued by capitalists to because it's profitable for them. Or take fast food. I love fast food personally. I know it's not good for me, and its existence generally isn't good for society, but it's done anyways, and it's produced anyways because it's profitable for capitalists to get people addicted to the chemicals they put in to fast food and so on. So the problem isn't that capitalism doesn't, under capitalism, the profit motive doesn't ever align with the needs of humanity. It's that it often doesn't, and when it doesn't, it can lead to some very harmful externalities. And you say that under communism, production can't meet the needs of humanity or whatever. But I see no evidence for this, honestly. You say it's too slow or whatever, but I think that would be a claim that for me to take it seriously, it would sort of have to be substantiated. And I'm sure that you can substantiate it. I'm just saying that I haven't heard it substantiated to this point. Perhaps you're referring to the calculation problem. I have a response to that if that's what you want to bring up or so on. But I see no evidence that communism wouldn't lead to or wouldn't be able to meet for the needs of humanity. In fact, I think production under communism would meet the needs of humanity more than production under capitalism, because there isn't this distortionary profit motive that often contradicts the needs of humanity. So I think that interpretation is exactly backwards. And I think that's all the points you made. I guess I would just ask you this one last question. So I talked about the human nature argument, or the communism leading to authoritarianism argument. And I said that I see no reason why this would happen, and by the Marxist definition, communism is anti-authoritarian. And I think I seem to remember you bringing up some explanation for why communism must necessarily lead to authoritarianism. I think it was because you need a state to enforce certain things, because people will just take from one another, and there will need to be a state to enforce it or whatever. Is that your argument?
Basically, yes. Humans look out for themselves. There are times when we do come together. I'm going to get more into that when I rebut this.
Yeah.
But no, typically, in my view, a government should be, and this is what it should be, and this is kind of what, basically, a government should be like a hockey referee. Mm-hmm. As long as you're not doing some gross violation of the rules, they stay the hell out. They let us have our little hockey fight. But as long as we're not, putting a thumb in the eye, they don't really intervene. Mm-hmm. Type of thing. Government should be a bit of a referee, not a parent.
Okay, yeah. So, so I guess as far as that point, if your argument for why communism must turn authoritarian sort of goes back to the human nature argument, then I guess I don't have to really respond, because I've already sort of responded to the human nature argument. So, I guess I'll kick it back to you.
Okay. Okay. As I stated in the last one, animals are the ones that are in constant conflict. They, of course, fight over resources. This has been the tale as old as time. Now, human beings, we do sometimes come together and cooperate with each other. But then the dust settles, and then we go back to worrying about ourselves. Like if a natural disaster hits, do humans come together and show incredible generosity? Of course. And also, thanks to capitalism, we can afford to be extremely generous. And we do have a common benefit to most things that we do. It's called money. You moved on to a cooperative society. Well, I have not seen a successful example of a cooperative society that lasted for more than maybe a century. And that's pushing it. I mean, the USSR lasted for, I think, 80 years, and then it was done. The Dutch that you mentioned, but at the time, they were strongly capitalistic. They were the world's bank for the longest time, especially at the time that you mentioned. And war was not an invention of 10,000 years ago. War has been with us since we were living in the caves. There's evidence of cavemen going to war with other cave pods, I don't know what you want to call them, and they were fighting for a resource. The resource was women. Sorry, ladies, but it was true. But I'm not a Cro-Magnon man, so blame them. If we do not have an inherent competitiveness in us, then my question is, why are sports so popular? Sure, they're a lot of fun to watch. I don't know if you watch sports, but the reason is because humans are competitive creatures. Capitalism nurtures that competitive nature. Communism tries to get us something that we're not, where we'll play nice, be fair, and share. The answer is no, we're not going to share. Again, if human beings were not competitive, then sports would not be a thing. And again, maybe capitalism could be better described as like a boxing match, where two people are fighting, but they're not trying to kill each other. Let's see. Sports. There has to be an authoritarian state in communism because, again, people will not work with each other because I'm going to keep harping on this point. People don't give a crap about each other. They really don't. Again, Lenin had to come with guns and take the farmers' wheat by force because they were more than happy to sell the wheat, but they weren't just going to give their labor away. That's the thing. Communism requires people to give their labor away for free, whatever that labor is. Well, why would I work if I'm going to get nothing out of it? Why would I attempt to innovate if I'm going to get nothing out of it? Sure, you get some satisfaction of creating art for art's sake or creating for creation's sake. Like, I don't get a whole lot out of my cooking show. I still do it because I love to cook. But would I like it a lot better if I had a bunch of sponsorships and some money? Yeah, hell yeah. Would I like it to be the biggest cooking channel on YouTube? Yeah. That's, let's see. I don't want to get off on a tangent. The Marx dream that you mentioned, basically this stateless society that everybody just walks hand in hand. We're all singing fucking Kumbaya. That's a pipe dream. That's impossible. A state is absolutely necessary, and I say that as pretty much a libertarian. Because, quite frankly, without a state, without that referee, human being, it would be anarchy. People would just. You're assuming that human beings, by their nature, are good. As we're seeing sometimes with this coronavirus, it doesn't, it doesn't work. It's not that we're evil. It's just we're out for ourselves. If there's one last can of baby formula, I could honestly see two dads fighting over it. For an example, and without a state to say, "Hey, gentlemen, you can actually beat the living shit out of each other," or one beat the other one to death. Again, I bring up, why would you create something without a reward? I mean, again, you can create something just for creation's sake. That's fine, but that feeling wears off fairly quickly. Most people create something for a reward. Usually the reward is money. Or to be the best at something, or to do something. They just don't create. Nobody gets into, let's say, boxing or MMA without the desire to be the champion, the best in the world. They don't get into it to be, I'd like to be in the top 500. Nobody does that. No, they get in there because they want to be number one. That's, and quite frankly, I think you would see a vast destruction of innovation if you took away the profit motive. Finally, to wrap this up, your last 2 points. Capitalism has raised the standard of living for basically everyone in the world. World poverty right now, today, is at its lowest level in history. Communism really can't say that. Again, capitalism, it basically it comes in, it does wonderful things, and asks very little in return. And as for, you brought up McDonald's. These are products that we don't need. They're typically not that great for you. Well, there's a surefire way to end McDonald's, and that's to convince everyone to stop going there. Suddenly, McDonald's is out of business. If it was a state-run communist restaurant, it's still in business, and most likely that's the only one you get to eat at. Furthermore, fast food restaurants, if you haven't noticed, have been changing their menu to have more healthy options because of the changing nature of the consumer. Under capitalism, a business either has to adapt to the needs and wants of the consumer or it dies. And again, production is always slower under a communist society. This is the last. Because there is there's no money motive. Why would somebody work 60 hours unless they had a gun put to the back of their head without getting money, without getting their agreed upon wage? So I'm going to let you respond. I may not respond to points because I have to take a quick restroom break, but take it away.
Okay, so I tried to write that. That was a lot, but I tried to write it all down. So first, animals, you say animals are in constant conflict. Humans can cooperate, but when the dust settles, we go back to looking for ourselves. I think that the historical examples I gave did a reasonable job at disproving that idea. The examples I gave, for example, are early Netherlands and also other certain towns in early Scotland and so on. Have existed in a long-term fashion in a way which was built around constant mutual cooperation. Of course, people are always going to look out for themselves to some extent, but this doesn't mean that a society can't be created where, in general, people are incentivized to cooperate with each other and work in the interests of society as a whole. So, it's not just in extreme scenarios where people can cooperate, but in fact, I gave multiple examples of long-term sort of societies where people cooperated for a very long time and saw flourishing because of it. So I reject that idea that it's only extreme scenarios that can bring about cooperation. You say cooperative societies no cooperative society has lasted more than a century. For one, that's not exactly true, and for two, that it seems to be, to me, in sort of an arbitrary cutoff, because if a lot of cooperative societies have existed and shown to be able to flourish based on cooperation, and then these societies in large part have been stamped out by imperialism and external forces. For example, the Paris Commune and revolutionary Catalonia were stamped out externally, not by the nature of their own contradictions. If cooperative societies have shown to be sustainable for a fairly long time, but are routinely stamped out by external force, and thus don't typically last as long, then that's not exactly an argument that these cooperative societies can't work, are intrinsically not conducive to human nature. In fact, this is one of the first points that Kropotkin brought up in The Conquest of Bread, where he talks about how people falsely mistake the fact that many cooperative, sort of mutual aid-based societies haven't lasted as long. They mistake that for the fact that it's intrinsically not workable or not conducive to human nature, when in fact the majority of these examples didn't last as long because they were stamped out by external force. So I don't like that argument of, cooperative societies haven't lasted as long. Also, you say, we've always been at war. Again, I would refer back to the study I referenced earlier. It was a French study, an anthropological study, where it was found that, of course there's going to be some fighting between, Paleolithic beings and so on. I'm not saying there was no conflict or no fighting. What I'm saying is that the like straight up war, like the raging of war, like actual war, not just like some conflict, some fighting, started only 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic period because of the birth of productive economy, accumulation of resources, and a change in productive structures. So it was not something that like we go to war because it's intrinsic to our nature. It's something where we go to war because developments in the base of society, developments in the mode of production, have led to changes in the superstructure, which create incentives and so on, which makes humans go to war. So I think, and this is an academic study, and so I think this is generally a reliable thing to go off of. It's solid anthropological research. I can send it to you if you want. So yeah, I think that concretely refutes this idea that like humans just have like war and so on baked into their nature. You also say, if we aren't inherently competitive, why are sports popular? But I never said, okay, so my claim about human nature is that within human nature exists a wide variety of contradictory tendencies and so on. Human nature is contradictory and it's fluid, and it has differing impulses which can be actualized to different extents depending on different material conditions. That was my claim. So all the popularity of sports proves is that our human nature has a tendency to be competitive, that this is a tendency within our human nature that can be actualized. And I never said that it wasn't. I just said that this tendency towards competition isn't immutable or intrinsic in the way that you are implying it is. So I don't think the popularity of sports necessarily refutes what I was saying. And also I would like to point out that I saw this. I thought of an interesting point where which I got from a professor of logic called Ben Burgess, where he brought up the fact that if you break this argument from human nature down into a premise conclusion format, the first premise would be human natures are intrinsic, or humans by virtue of their human nature are intrinsically greedy and competitive and so on. And premise 2 would be if humans are intrinsically competitive and greedy, that means they can't cooperate. And then the conclusion would be humans can't cooperate and so on. But even if premise 1 was correct, even if I were to grant your claims about human nature, it doesn't follow from that. Or premise 2, which leads to the conclusion that if humans are greedy, then they can't cooperate. That clearly isn't true, because we see that even within capitalist society, humans in sort of microcosms, we can see that they are able to, despite their supposed greedy and violent human nature, they're able to cooperate to really tremendous degrees. And for example, look at like worker cooperatives, which have been found to be actually more productive and more successful than traditional businesses, where the workers work together and democratically arrive at decisions rather than it's sort of a top-down competitive structure. And these worker co-ops have been shown to be more effective than traditional businesses. So even if I were to grant your first premise that humans are intrinsically greedy and so on, the second premise, which leads that premise to its conclusion, cannot be true if we are to look at empirical reality. So you also talk about how capitalism incentivizes work. This I will largely refer to the same argument that I did when I talked about my innovation argument. So yes, money is one incentive to work, but it's not the only incentive to work. And I would argue it's maybe not even the most powerful incentive. For example, I, on occasion, clean my room. I don't clean my room because I'm getting paid to clean my room. I clean my room because I feel responsible for my room. I want my surroundings to be a comfortable place to live in. Sometimes people just feel like they need to work and so on because they feel responsible for their surroundings. So work, while money is one incentive for work, it's not the only incentive for work. I would argue it's not the strongest incentive for work. And I would argue furthermore that it's an incentive which, through the alienation and so on, which it creates, which the profit motive creates, it actively suppresses other incentives. So if this profit motive incentive were to go away, then the other incentives for work, which capitalism is currently suppressing, would become more prominent, and therefore I don't think we have any basis on which to say that that the elimination of capitalism would, in any sense, lead to a net reduction in work and so on. I mean, for empirical evidence of this, just look at like UBI, right? Like when people get a UBI, all their expenses have been taken care of, but multiple studies, for example, studies from Canada and so on, have found that even when people receive a UBI, they don't work any less. And to the extent that they do work less, it's to the minor extent that they do work less, because I made a mistake, they do work a tiny bit less, it's because they're going and pursuing education and taking care of their kids and so on. And this is even when they have the expenses of life taken care of. So, and this is further vindicated by the fact that when people aren't able to work, even when they're on unemployment and so on, if they're not able to work, they become depressed and their suicide rates skyrocket and they become addicted to drugs. And I think this is because work is something humans always done. It's sort of a part of what Marx said quite dramatically is their species essence. And it's something that I don't think people need a profit motive to do. You also say, people just don't care about each other enough to, cooperate and so on. Again, I think that's sort of refuted by the historical examples I gave where people did cooperate to the extent that I'm talking about. I think you might be conflating sort of the alienation we feel under capitalism from one another to something which is intrinsic to society, which I think is a sort of a dangerous conflation to make. But I think even if we don't really care for each other, we still have a common interest in sort of making a flourishing society and so on. And so I think that whether or not people care about each other, it's been seen empirically that people are able to cooperate even on a very large scale to an extent, to the extent that I'm talking about. You say that having no state is a pipe dream, and without a referee, people would have anarchy. To this, I'm going to respond with a passage from Lenin's State and Revolution, which I think makes a really interesting point on this note. So, so Lenin's talking about how, according to Engels, and this has been vindicated by like modern studies and so on, the state emerged out of the irreconcilability of class conflicts. And Engels says that the second distinguishing feature of the establishment of the state is a public power, meaning like an army, a police force, and so on, which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. And then Lenin goes on to say, a standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power, but how else can it be? From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans of the end of the 19th century whom Engels was addressing, and who had not gone through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not have been otherwise. They could not understand at all what a self-acting armed organization of the population was. When asked why it became necessary to have special bodies of armed men placed above society and alienating themselves from it, for example, a police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to utter a few phrases borrowed from Spencer of, it's a word I'm not going to try to pronounce, to refer to the growing complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so on. Were it not, but such a reference seems scientific and effectively lulls the ordinary person to sleep by obscuring the important and basic fact, namely the split of society into irreconcilable antagonistic classes. Were it not for this split, the self-acting armed organization of the population would differ from the primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys, or of primitive men, or of men united in clans, by its complexity, its high technical level, and so on. But such an organization would still be possible. So what that's essentially saying is that this idea of a state which places itself above society and which operates police and military, it seems necessary given the complexity of our society. But in fact, it only emerged because of class conflict. It only emerged because, given the cleavage of society into opposing classes, there could not be a self-organizing army or police force or whatever of the people, because the whole purpose of the state is to manage the conflict between classes, which a self-acting organization would only exacerbate. So it's not true that the having no state is like a pipe dream. In fact, the only reason we have a state is because of the irreconcilability of class conflict. Before the split of society into classes, there were sort of organizations of the people, self-regulating organizations of the people, and it's not because society became more complex that a state became necessary. Because as Lenin points out, if it were just because of the complexity, then self-acting organizations of the people could still exist. They would just be more complex and more intricate. The only reason that the state became necessary, which places itself above society, is not because of growing complexity. It's simply because of the cleavage of society into classes. So the idea that the state is a pipe dream, the state is not something which is necessary. It's not something which has only existed. It's an aspect of the superstructure which only exists because of the development of the mode of production at a certain point in time. You also said that I wrongly assume that humans are inherently good. That's not true. I never really said that. I don't ascribe like any moral status. I'm saying that I never said humans are inherently good. In fact, I sort of argued against the idea of an inherent human nature. I said that human nature has a bunch of human nature is contradictory and fluid, and it has the capacity to be competitive, and it has the capacity to be cooperative. But I never ascribed any moral status like humans are inherently good. And I think the claims I made about human nature are backed up by solid anthropological data. You also said people look out for themselves. I agree with that. I don't think that really refutes what I'm saying. Just because people generally look out for themselves doesn't mean that there can't be a society which incorporates, mass cooperation among the people to create a flourishing society. Even if people look out for themselves, there's still a common interest, a common self-interest in creating like a flourishing society and so on. So I don't think the idea that people look out for themselves contradicts the idea of mutual aid and cooperation. And in fact, again, I will go back to my historical examples I've pointed out. We have seen that people have been able to cooperate in this way. So clearly the fact that people look out for themselves doesn't contradict the idea that people can cooperate in this way. Yeah, I'm almost getting to the end of it. You said a lot of things. So you also said that people do things because they want to be number one, so we need a profit motive. You brought up UFC fighters, for example. But I would say that UFC fighters, they don't want to be number one. I mean, I'm sure profit has something to do with it. UFC fighters don't primarily want to be the best because they want the most money. I think primarily it has to do with social status, right? And so social status isn't necessarily a profit motive. What you're pointing out and bringing up the example of UFC fighters is that there are other incentives besides the profit motive which can drive people to work extremely hard towards certain ends. And also, if I were to give you the idea that the UFC example backed up your point, I would say that that doesn't necessarily refute what I'm saying, because again, all you're pointing out is that, this aspect of human nature is actualized and taken advantage of within capitalism, but that doesn't necessarily refute the idea that it can't be otherwise, that these aspects of human nature are immutable and so on. You also say that capitalism has raised the standard of living and poverty has been lowered, and communism can't say that. As far as poverty being lowered, there's actually some controversy around that. So like the World Bank throughout history has changed what the poverty line is in a way which has been contentious among scholars, because the way in which the World Bank has changed the poverty line has not been honest. The poverty line has been changed by the World Bank in such a way to give the illusion that poverty has fallen, because they keep changing the threshold for what constitutes poverty. But there's been much academic contention around how the World Bank defines poverty. For example, certain academics have come up with the ethical poverty line and showed that if you change the threshold for poverty, poverty under capitalism has actually been increasing, and so on. So, I think that the conclusion that capitalism has, raised the standard of living, well, I think that part's true. That part is true through industrialization, but that has lowered poverty. It's based around faulty data, which has been very contentious. But also, humans don't deny that capitalism has raised the standard of living, right? The capitalist idea is that every mode of production has had, thus far, a progressive phase in society. Even feudalism had a progressive phase in society where it increased standards of living from what they were under slave society and so on. So Marxists don't deny, and communists don't deny, at least those of us who are familiar with Marx's work, and agree with it, that capitalism, we don't disagree that capitalism has raised the standard of living, right? This is not a point that we argue against. The point I would argue against is you say that capitalism has raised the standard of living, communism can't say the same thing to the same extent, and therefore capitalism is better than communism. And I think this again goes back to the fact that, as I was talking about earlier, capitalism and communism are at different stages of historical development. Capitalism already went through the phase where it failed numerous times, learned from its failures, and then became the global mode of production. Communism has not gone through this historical phase. They're at two different historical phases in their development, so it's not like a one-to-one comparison where you can just compare them and say, see, capitalism has led to better results than communism, and therefore we should keep it. So I reject that comparison. And finally, you say McDonald's could be ended if people stopped going there. Under state-run communism, people would have to go there. Again, communism isn't about the state running things. Communism, by Marx's definition, and by Lenin even's definition, by Luxemburg's definition, by Engels' definition, has always been intrinsically a stateless, bottom-up society of organic relations between people. It's not a top-down, state-run organization. And you also say that, McDonald's would be ended if people stopped going there. Unfortunately, people refuse to stop going there because McDonald's has, despite the fact that it's bad for people, made their food very, addictive and hard to get off of and so on, and also has such massive advertising power that it can convince so many people to go there regardless of whether or not it's good for them. But also, I could even grant you, like the McDonald's example, the only point that I was trying to make there is that sometimes the needs of humanity contradict the interests of capital and the interests of profit. And this is clearly true. Even if I granted you fine, McDonald's is a bad example, I could still say that, and I don't think anybody could actually argue against the idea that sometimes what's profitable isn't what's good for humanity. I mean, just look at the Iraq War, look at climate change, look at, all of these different things. And so I guess like the final point that I would like to make is you said that the Netherlands isn't an example for, what I said about mutual aid or whatever, because it was like it had capitalism. First of all, I'm not necessarily talking about what mode of production they had. I'm talking about the ethos which the society was based around. And I can, and also I'm not, my history is pretty bad, admittedly, but I could grant you that this was like the epicenter of capitalism or whatever, and still say that it had a society built around mutual aid. And I can give you an excerpt, actually, from a report of the Agricultural Commission of the Netherlands in the time period I was referring to, which illustrates exactly what I was saying about how they're a society built around mutual aid. And it talks about the habit of having one thrashing machine which makes the round of many farms. Hiring it in turn is widely spread, as it is by the time in early every other country. But one finds here and there a commune which keeps one thrashing machine for the community. And it goes on and on. I have like a whole page of excerpts from this Agriculture Commission of Netherlands proving that they were a society built around mutual aid and mutual cooperation rather than competition and so on. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. I'm going to rebut a few of the points. I'm not going to go on too long, but we've been doing this for about 90 minutes. After I'm done, do you want to throw it Q&A from my chat?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, guys, once I get done
Wait,
rebutting my
sorry,
point...
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I might have, like, some final thoughts after
Okay.
you speak, and then we can go to the Q&A.
Okay, just, I guess, make it brief. Very, very quickly, you've brought up climate change several times. I guarantee you capitalism will find a way to alleviate these problems far sooner, far quicker, and far more efficiently than any communist solution. As the largest communist country on the planet, China, they cough up 3 times what we cough up in carbon. Capitalism does breed cooperation. But that's due to, again, the mutual goal and the profit motive. Human beings will come together, but they either have to have a common goal or they have to have a mutual enemy. And war has always been with us from the time that we evolved from the great apes. Maybe not state versus state war, that may be 10,000 years old, but war as a concept has been with us for about 1 million years since we evolved. You brought up cleaning your room. Well, cleaning the house, mowing your lawn, shoveling the snow, that's all, yes, it's unpaid labor, but you're also protecting your investment, which is your property, your home. And because you paid a shit ton of money for it, you obviously keep it nice. Again, if you are creating things outside of the profit motive, then that's just a hobby. Now, that's just fine. If you want to create art for creating art, that's fine. But if you want it to be your living, if that's what you want to do as a living, then it is a profit-driven business enterprise. And you should be thinking about how much money you're charging for your paintings. Again, if you want to create things just to create things, that's fine. Very quickly, I had a buddy, his wife, she knitted me a scarf. She just liked knitting. But I asked her, would you ever consider, because she was good at it, I was like, would you ever consider doing it as a business? Because I think you could make something out of this. And she's like, no, it would take all the fun away. That's fine. If you want to create things because it makes you feel better, that's fine. But again, that wasn't her job. That wasn't her career. That was just her hobby. When you do things just because you like to do them, then it's a hobby. I would like to know what state actually does have a UBI. The only one I've heard of is Spain, and that was due to the beverage bug outbreak. As for the, again, I have to go back to the USSR. People are not going to work just because they like to work. I reiterate that in the USSR, the civilian markets had nothing on the shelf. Now, the special markets set aside for government officials and the KGB, they had shelves fully stocked. So, I guess I'm just going to wrap this up. I'm going to skip over some points I had just because I want to be as brief as possible. McDonald's can be ended. Okay, they're not a state-run entity. They're not too big to fail. Far larger companies than McDonald's have, believe it or not, risen and fallen and are now no more. The reason that people go to McDonald's also is not because of any addictive chemicals or properties of their food. They go to them because they're convenient, people are lazy, Or they're drunk and they're on DoorDash.com. I have done that sometimes myself. Well, that's why I've always said there's no excuse to drive drunk, kids. There's DoorDash.com and Uber.
Hey man, sounds responsible to me.
So, if you have any little final thoughts, I would say start getting your questions in the chat now.
Okay, I'll try to be as quick as possible. I just have some final thoughts on the things that you said. So you said that you think capitalism will alleviate climate change. For example, communist country China has contributed so much to climate change. I disagree with the idea that capitalism will alleviate climate change. In fact, a recent global carbon project forecast found that in 2017, while renewables are surging, energy from fossil fuels is still outpacing low carbon emissions, and they even expected fossil carbon dioxide's emissions to grow in coming years after flattening in 2014 and 2016. So there's no evidence that capitalism, the profit motive, and competition is just doing away with climate change. China, I would dispute the fact that China is a communist country. China still has generalized commodity production and markets and the state and so on. So by the Marxist definition, which I'm using, China isn't a communist country. But even so, the only reason why China has contributed so much to climate change is because of the global capitalist clash created by capitalist overaccumulation of 2008 needed a massive investment in order to be overcome. And in China, that investment took the form of investments in industries which saw carbon emissions rise pretty rapidly. So even China's contribution to climate change was in fact caused by a capitalist crisis, which came about due to capitalist tendency towards overaccumulation. He said capitalism breeds cooperation because of the profit motive and the common goal, and people need a common goal for cooperation. I would agree people need a common goal for cooperation, but I think that my idea was that people would cooperate to make society better. I think that is a common goal, and so I think that communism has this common goal that you say is needed for people to cooperate. And you say that you feel responsible for your home. I agree, and that's why you work to clean it. I agree people feel responsible for their home, and I would say largely the reason people don't feel responsible for their communities broadly in the same way is because of the alienation which is created by capitalism. Marx talked about how capitalism alienates us from each other, from our communities, and so on, but that's a whole nother discussion. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It's very dense. You say that if you create things out of a profit motive, that's just a hobby. If you want to do something for a living, you have to do it for profit. That's true under capitalism, but I don't think that you saying that that's true under capitalism means that it's necessarily a necessary form of organization or a necessary occurrence. You asked what state has a UBI, because I brought up UBI as an evidence. No state that I know of currently has a UBI, but Canada had a UBI for a short term, which was the source of this study I was talking about, where it didn't lead to people working less to a great extent. You also said that people won't work just because they want to, because in the USSR, civilian markets had nothing on the shelves. The reason that the USSR markets had so little consumer goods is because they were striving so hard for rapid industrialization, because they were a poor third world country, an industrialization which they achieved. And also, I don't see how, the USSR, the state of affairs in the USSR means that people won't work just because they want to, as the USSR is not communist by the Marxist definition, and even Lenin admitted this. And you also said that McDonald's is something which can be ended. Fine. I mean, I don't want to argue too much about McDonald's. I would just say that I did in my last segment say that I could completely grant you the idea of McDonald's. The only point, I was just using that as an offhanded example for how the needs of humanity doesn't always coincide with the needs of profit. I think that's just undeniably true. Even the strongest capitalists will agree to this, and this is why, even libertarians like yourself say that we need some sort of a state to make sure that where capitalism or the profit motive contradicts the needs of humanity, that those externalities are sort of taken care of. And that's all I had to say. I guess my final point would be that there was one thing you said at the very beginning of this debate that I never went over. You said that, my argument from democracy wasn't good because, we don't necessarily live in a democracy. We live in a republic. I guess that's sort of like a pedantic disagreement. And not a disagreement because I agree with you, but I guess that's just sort of like a pedantic point because I wasn't referring to democracy in the purely like strict sense. Of course, there will always be the need for some degree of delegation and so on. Okay. And also, I guess that was just sort of besides my point. But okay, I guess we can go to the Q&A now because that's all the thoughts I
had. Hero, I know you got the first question in, but go to Olga Yarmchuk. Sorry if I butchered your name, Olga. She asked a two-part question. How can you, an American, defend communism when you didn't have to grow up in communist Soviet Ukraine like I did? And then she says, how can any American who didn't grow up under communist Ukraine rule like I did justify defending communism? I've seen the result firsthand. So that's directed at you.
Okay, so first of all, I would dispute the idea that you lived under communism. Of course, I'm not saying that I have a monopoly on the definition of communism, but if you're trying to argue against me, my definition of communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, which does away with generalized commodity production, and the Ukraine certainly did not meet that definition of communism, so I reject the premise of your question. And also, this is another appeal to the fact that communism has failed in initial implementation, which I can grant, and I don't think that means that communism is intrinsically an unworkable system, as capitalism failed in initial implementation as well. So I guess that would just be my quick response to that.
Okay, Hero, you got the first question in. How does communism work without the oppression of the common people?
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really understand that question. Communism can't have the oppression.
Well, I can give you a follow-up. This is Elizabeth, I hate you. I love that username. Why does communism always come with a high death toll? Now, it actually does.
Yeah, so...
1 million people. Okay. Stalin killed 60. Mm-hmm. Mao, 120.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess... The idea is that communism comes with a high death toll. I would refute this in a couple different ways. For one, I think capitalism comes with an enormous death toll as well. People just don't typically actually count it as capitalism's death toll because it's just not considered in that way for some weird arbitrary reason. But think of all the deaths which occurred under British colonialism, which were done for profit because of the mechanisms of the capitalist system. That's millions of deaths. Think of, World War I and World War II, which were wars which were created by the tendency towards capital accumulation, which again caused millions of deaths because of the mechanisms of capitalism.
I gotta cut you off there a little bit. I gotta cut you off there a little bit. Communist death toll is higher than both World War I and World War II together.
Okay, but it's not higher than the death toll of capitalism if you take into account the roughly 20 million people who die every year because of a lack of medicine, food, and water, because despite the fact that we produce more than enough medicine, food, and water to provide for everyone on Earth, because the mechanisms of capital has it only providing for exchange value rather than use value, rather than the needs of the people. So if you take into account the 20 million people who die every year because of lack of resources, because of capitalism producing exchange value, its death toll massively exceeds communism's death toll. But again, this is sort of like pedantic because this is again just an appeal to the failures in the initial implementations of communism, that it went in bad directions the first few times it's been tried, or the first several times it's been tried, to be fair. But again, I don't think that failure in initial implementation, I sound like a broken record, but this point just keeps coming up, so I guess I have to keep saying it, but failure in initial implementation can't mean that a system is intrinsically unworkable, because if it did, we wouldn't be living under capitalism.
Okay, I'm going to go to Anonymous 101. Can we ever get to a communist society where everyone takes the goods that are owned in common and is available to all as needed without government force? I don't think we can.
Without government force, in the sense that government is necessary from the transition from capitalism to communism. If that was the question, then yes, I believe that the government is needed for the transition. This is the idea.
I don't think we'd ever get there as humans. Not unless you get the Star Trek replicator or something.
Well, yeah, I guess we've hashed out that enough in our debate, though. So,
yeah, because look at the beverage bug with hoarding bind. Okay, this is another question from Hero. Why do people abuse welfare to not work rather than working for the greater good?
So that's actually not true. I read an Oxford study a while back that said that the welfare state, or various welfare programs, for example, Head Start and food stamps, they decrease the extent to which people work by what the authors claimed was, quote, almost nothing. So there is a very minuscule attempt. This idea of the welfare queen or whatever, it's just not true. About 2/3 of people who are on welfare are either working or have a family member who's working. And then a lot of the 1/3 literally can't work because they're disabled and so on. So almost everybody who's on welfare...
No. If you're disabled, you have Social Security disability. That's a separate thing.
That's welfare.
Welfare abuse is far more rampant. I've studied this. This is another debate, but I've studied this, and no, welfare abuse is rampant because right now all you have to do is work 30 days, and once you leave, you can then get another 2 years of welfare. And the food stamps, one of the great lies is that it's $2.50 a day or something ridiculous like that. Well, that's only if you're a single person, one person getting food stamps. If you're a family of 4, you get $250 a week for food stamps.
Right. So I guess my counterpoint would be that on the note of these people are getting Social Security and so on, Social Security is classified as welfare, so that is that isn't part what I was talking about. And then as far as the idea of welfare abuse, I don't know what research you've done. I'm sure we could argue about this for a long time, but just to cite what I was saying, the study I was citing was, and I quote, in an exhaustive program-by-program analysis of all federal anti-poverty programs, Mathematica policy research economist Yonatan Ben Shalom, Johns Hopkins University economist Robert A. Moffett, and University of Wisconsin-Madison economist John Carl Schultz found that the work disincentive effects have, quote unquote, basically zero effect on the overall poverty rate. Furthermore, state suggests that 2/3 of people on welfare are working or have a family member who's working, as I already said, and over 9/10 of entitlement benefit spending goes to elderly, disabled, or working households. So, according to the data that I've engaged with and that I've just presented, this idea of rampant poverty, rampant welfare abuse is just not a real issue.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna do a few more because I do got to get out of here. Okay. Olga is back, and she says, "Why is it that you American communists say that what places like the Ukraine and the Caucasus Soviet states lived under isn't true blue communism or socialism? That she basically came from Ukraine and lived under the actual regimes for the first 13 years of her life. Apparently, she actually had members who were killed by the communist government because they were critical of it. Mm-hmm. And here in America, I can legally say fuck Trump and nothing will happen to me."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess my response would be, obviously it's awful that family members were killed by the state. That's something I absolutely oppose. I think that's abhorrent. But as far as I hate, because this is going to sound really bad, but just I have to say it. I don't think that living under a certain regime gives you any more of an intellectual authority to say whether or not that regime was a communist regime or whatever. For example, people in North Korea say that North Korea is democratic. I don't think anybody would actually, who's not an insane tanky, would actually support the idea or agree with the idea that North Korea is democratic. It quite clearly is not democratic. So just because, you are in a certain regime or a certain regime says they're communist, that doesn't mean they're actually communist. As far as the crux of the question, which is that, well, how can I say that they're not communist? Well, I can say that they're not communist because I'm a Marxist, and I've read Marx's works like Critique of the Gotha Program, and I've read Engels' works like in the German ideology, and I've read Engels' works like The Principles of Communism and so on. And according to Marx and Engels, and even according to Lenin and like State and Revolution and in other works, communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society.
But you are aware that
no generalized commodity production. Ukraine was none of these things, nor was Soviet Union or China or whatever else.
But you are aware that Lenin had the entire Romanov family killed.
Yes.
Just gunned down in cold blood. So he obviously didn't believe that. And finally,
wait.
And this is
Lenin had these people killed in the transition to communism. That doesn't mean he thought that's what communism was.
He didn't care then. But finally, and this is true. This is the last question. Because I heard this from the Bernie Sanders campaign. Why is it that any political dissidents must go to either a gulag or a re-education camp? And Bernie Sanders' own campaign staff were saying they'd like to send people like me who defend capitalism and like my capitalist country and like my free market society. I would be sent to a re-education camp. Why is it that communism cannot handle a political difference?
Well, I think there's been many communist societies which aren't authoritarian in the way that you're talking about them.
I don't remember a single one. They always delve into an authoritative state.
Well, that's not true. I mean, the Paris Commune, there was Revolutionary Catalonia, there were the German and Hungary communes, the Spartacus League, and so on. And so I don't know. I guess I reject that premise. I agree. It's horrible. The re-education, the gulags, it's horrible. But these haven't existed in every communist state. I don't think using like a drunk Bernie campaign staffer named Kyle, who's just like
no, he wasn't. He wasn't drunk. He was actually at Bernie Sanders campaign headquarters when he said it.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, regardless.
And he was several, and it was more than one too. They have this idea that if you agree, because Bernie Sanders is a rampant fanatical socialist, that we're going to have to re-educate people like me, or and I don't know what to do when I would ultimately refuse. Probably I would say put a bullet in my head, but believe it or not, those soy boys probably would not load a gun. I'd have to do it myself. But the thing is any communist government, they don't give a crap what you believe as long as you all believe the same thing together. Communist governments, as far as I've seen throughout history, do not tolerate political dissidents. They also cannot tolerate it, and this would cause it to basically splinter, is if somebody who was making, let's say, wheat said, you know what? No, I'm not sharing my wheat. It's mine. I grew it. It's mine. Piss off. Can't work that way. So communism falls the second somebody starts looking out for themselves. Communism hates the idea of the individual.
No, so as far as like the Bernie Sanders ordeal, I would reject the idea that Bernie Sanders is like a communist or a genuine socialist. I think Bernie Sanders' policy is definitely more aligned more with like social democracy. As far as communism hating, so I don't think that Bernie Sanders' stance is representative of the communist stance. As far as communism hating the individual, I mean, Marx said himself that the primary goal of communism, this is literally a quote, almost word for word, is the full and free development of of every individual to the greatest extent possible. So communism is in fact very individualistic. This right-wing split between communism and collectivism, or communism and individualism, it's artificial. This isn't what Marx talked about or believed. And as far as the idea that, Marx's or communism would fall apart as soon as somebody would say, like, hey, I want to, keep the products of my labor or whatever. Again, this is an appeal to historical examples of communism, but I reject that these states have actually achieved communism. So you're sort of assuming a premise in that argument, which I don't sign on to.
Okay. Well, that's where this one's going to end, ladies. It's been a fun time talking Mouthy Infidel, and this has been Capitalism versus Communism, the Great Debate.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. And, all right, stream's over.
All right.
So